Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. There have been a number of books written about the history of Australia, charting the key moments and individuals who shaped this nation. Historians from Geoffrey Blainey, Stuart McIntyre, Thomas Keneally and Henry Reynolds have tackled this topic, each with their own unique perspective on the story of Australia. But what about the political history of Australia? Love it or hate it, politics shapes our lives. Joining me on Afternoon Light is friend of the Robert Menzies Institute and leading Australian historian, Professor Frank Bongiorno, who has written the first political history of Australia. His book, Dreamers and Schemers, follows previous books, including the 80s, the decade that transformed Australia, and the sex lives of Australians. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Frank.
Thanks, Georgina. It's lovely to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. And you really do choose a nice provocative title for your books, don't you?
This one I have to credit one of our PhD students, star PhD students, Joshua Black. So I sort of had a brains trust for this. I'm very bad at titles and we played with a few ideas and Josh eventually came up with this. So I was lucky in having some good advice.
Well done, Josh. I recorded a podcast with Josh last year and he is a rising star and fantastic that young people, and I can say that now I'm well entrenched in middle age, young people are getting into Australian political history and you're doing a great job mentoring so many of them, Frank. But Frank, political history of Australia, and I note that you wrote this during COVID, so a time when we were really reduced to sitting in our lounge rooms consuming whatever was going on the TV, radio or social media. So there was a lot of politics, for better or worse. What inspired you to write this very comprehensive political history of Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Georgina. Well, there hadn't been a sort of general political history of Australia before, not one that covered really the whole period of British settlements in Australia. And I also do have a few pages at least on pre-contact Indigenous societies too. So there hadn't been anything quite with that sort of scope. Whenever I told people I was working on this, they would ask me questions like, do you begin with federation? I guess the assumption that to write a political history of Australia was to write about the Australian nation state, the Commonwealth of Australia and its politics. But I've been teaching this really for many years, actually. I've been back in Australia from post in London. I came back in mid-2011 and had taught a course on Australian political history at the Australian National University fairly regularly, really since then, and had always taken the view that really to understand how the system worked, you really needed to go well back beyond 1901. What gives our system lifeblood, whether you're talking about its basic architecture, the way the parliamentary system has been designed, or whether you're talking about the broader ethos, the broader sort of democratic ethos, it went back much further. And that in a lot of ways, what happens with the formation of a national polity and a federation and a Commonwealth in 1901 is less dramatic, I think, in some ways than the shaping of the system much earlier in particularly the mid-colonial period, in the mid-19th century. So I was determined to do something that had that kind of breadth. And I sort of felt that if you wanted to say anything meaningful about our political culture, you did need to go back in that sort of way. I'm not the only one who's sort of concluded thus. I mean, Judith Brett, I know another friend of the Menzies Institute, has also written about electoral systems in that sort of way and has taken the story well back into the 19th century, I guess on that basis that you need that broader kind of perspective to make sense of it.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting aspect of your book, starting off with Indigenous political systems, which I think for many readers is going to be the first time they've really had exposure to how different Indigenous groups were able to organise themselves and decision-making. How did you come to tackle that? Because you've obviously been teaching this Australian political history for many years, but that's certainly, I think, quite a challenge to really understand how sort of pre-first contact, how Indigenous societies were organised in terms of their sort of political arrangements.
Yeah, I'm certainly no expert on those matters. So I took a lot of advice and spoke to anthropologist friends and others who'd worked, more closely in this area. And I read as widely as I could in, I guess, the literature, explorer journals, accounts by anthropologists in the 19th century. There'd been an old debate, actually, within anthropology going right back to certainly the 1950s, whether you could talk of Aboriginal societies in Australia as having a politics. And, of course, my conclusion is very much that you can, that they had quite sophisticated and in some ways quite participatory, actually, systems of decision-making. And when you look at the kinds of things that had to be decided, whether it was marriage alliances, how land would be used, I mean, we often think of there being some incredible almost stasis or radical stability in the ways in which Indigenous people belong to the land. And whilst that's broadly true, the reality is that as societies changed, there needed to be decisions made about who would be responsible for a particular country. All of these things required decision-making and quite sophisticated decision-making. And when you go and look at some of those 19th century accounts, you do get, through European eyes, accounts of the way in which that decision-making seems to have occurred. I mean, a lot of the British observers didn't know quite what to make of it. They saw assemblies that looked very deliberative and parliamentary even, and yet at the same time they'd say things like, oh, they have no politics or they have no government as we understand it. So as we often find, I guess, with a lot of observation by the newcomers of traditional Indigenous societies, they kind of saw without quite seeing in a lot of instances. But I did find it very interesting to go back to a lot of those first-hand accounts, and I guess what I've come up with is inevitably rather speculative and patchy, but that's probably embedded, I think, in the nature of the evidence.
But what you can chart, can't you, Frank, is how different Indigenous groups were able to then translate their own deliberative processes through to the British settler political processes and able to ask for consideration over particular issues around land. And you do talk about, is it William Barrack and the Corranderk land issue and how he was quite a sophisticated political operator with advisors. And this sort of goes against, I guess, some of the more traditional understandings of how Indigenous people were interacting with white settlers. And I think shows how they had a lot more agency than some of the stories that have been told in the past would suggest they had.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think, it's a larger theme of the book, actually, the ways in which a political system or set of political systems that are often designed to benefit one group actually opened up spaces for other groups, often marginalised groups. And I think that's broadly true of certainly the Koori of Victorian Indigenous people in the 1860s who pretty clear. The evidence is a bit circumstantial, but it's reasonably clear, I think, that they saw what was happening in white society. They witnessed the fact that there was a land reform movement going on in which ex-diggers and new migrants were agitating to open up the land to farming, and they wanted in on it too. And they drew on, yes, their own traditions, their own means of, I guess, political performance and demonstration in order to advance their own goals, which inevitably centred on regaining control of some land. And we find similar processes in the 19th century going on, I think, among Chinese Australians. We find women also, again, a group that was largely without vote in the 19th century, also, I think, finding those openings in order to use the political system to advance certain goals. I never suggest, of course, that they're able to do so on an equal basis. Of course, they weren't. But it is striking to me that the system has opened up those kinds of spaces, and certainly they were used and have been used by Indigenous people at particular times in Australia's political history.
Of course, one of the features of Australian society in the very, very early period of white settlement was it was a penal colony. So it was a very autocratic society, and I think your first chapter is autocracy, community and democracy from earliest times to 1855. So, that sense that there are the people, aside from the prison guards and the governors who were in Australia, the white settlers, were there against their will. They were forced to go there. How did that create a political environment? Was politics able to occur in that environment at all?
Yeah, it's really important. There were two aspects to this. Yes, it's a penal colony, and therefore really unique. I mean, there had been obviously transportation to North America, but the foundation of a colony whose purpose is effectively the banishment of prisoners is extremely unusual, if not unique. And that's one aspect, and that clearly has all sorts of implications for how politics played out. The other aspect of this, though, is the timing. I mean, this all occurs in the late 1780s and into the 1790s. And a point I make in the opening chapter of the book is this is a period of revolution and counter-revolution. So the penal colony is founded on the eve of the French Revolution. The Second Fleet brings news of the French Revolution. This is a period in which the authorities in Britain, the ruling class, if you like, is unusually worried about rebellion, uprising, mutiny, and with good reason. I mean, there are British naval mutinies, for instance, in the 1790s. It's a period of counter-revolution, and the way in which the political system emerges in New South Wales reflects, and Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, reflects that context. It is very autocratic. The governor is a kind of father figure. In all honesty, the regime was basically unlawful, probably until the 1820s. I mean, this was a position that the philosopher Jeremy Bentham took at the time, arguing from the early 1800s that there was a lack of a legal basis, a lack of a constitutional basis for what had been done. So it exists in this strange kind of space of dubious sort of constitutional validity, really, until you get legislation in the 1820s that sets up, I guess, a council, an appointed council, and some of the things that we would associate with a constitutional order. But yes, the fact that it's a penal colony, especially after 1815, between about 1815 and 1840, a very significant number of convicts arrive on much greater scale than in the early period. All of that makes for a bit of difficulty in imagining what a politics could look like. The idea that you could bring former prisoners into a political order was problematic for probably most decision makers, anyone with power in Britain during this kind of period. So you get a strange kind of political order. You do have a politics, but the politics plays out in places like the courtroom. It plays out through the anonymous circulation of libelous materials, often in verse form. It plays out in the streets, really, in who is willing to associate with other people, who's willing to shake whose hand in the street, who's willing to accept an invitation to the table of the governor, who you have into your home. These are the kinds of ways, really, in which it's a very personal politics. And I think these are the kinds of ways in which politics plays out, certainly up to the 1820s, and in a lot of ways even beyond the period when you get more institutions actually emerging.
It's interesting to reflect on the influence of that period on the Australian polity and character and our expectations of government. And it's been repeated many times over, especially during COVID, but Clive James famously saying that we're a nation descended from prison guards, not convicts, which is why we're so, we actually aren't the anti-authoritarian, lackadaisical, she'll be right, mate nation. We're actually very obedient. We will accept rules and we will give up our rights in exchange for the protection of government. And that idea that it was the government that was setting up a penal colony, providing for the basics. So you had some accommodation, you had some food, and it was a structured society where we deferred to authority without much recourse to our rights. You wonder how, in your observation, Frank, how does that still exist, that the overlays of that 19th century penal colony in current society?
Yes, I certainly am very indebted to John Hirst, the late John Hirst, for his writings on these matters, where he talked about Australians being an obedient people as distinct from the stereotype of the great anti-authoritarian. The argument I'd put is, in many ways, the key institution of Australia's democracy is founded right at the beginning, right in the late 1780s, and it's called the Commissariat, or the government store. And yes, it's essentially based on a military original. It's an adaptation of a military store. And its purpose is really to ensure that nobody starves, to ensure that the convicts, that their guards are clothed, are fed. It provides a kind of basic minimum. But it's important to keep in mind, although it's a government store, it's also a kind of public partnership. I mean, the officers who establish farms sell their produce to the store. The importers who bring in material, bring in things from India, for instance, they sometimes sell their produce to the store. The store acts as a bank. It's effectively a bank before Australia had a bank. Australia has no bank until the Bank of New South Wales in 1817. But the commissariat effectively operates as a bank. I'd argue this is the foundational kind of institution of our democracy. When I saw in, March 2020 during COVID, and a lot of this book was drafted during that period, I saw JobKeeper and JobSeeker rolled out. I saw the kind of spirit of the commissariat reaching down the centuries, because I think it was based on some of the same kinds of ideas. The idea that you provided a kind of minimum for people, that you would see people through. Government, I think, was pretty relaxed about the fact private businesses were going to make a lot of money out of this. And we know, of course, that many businesses that probably didn't need the assistance nonetheless got it and took it. But that's how the commissariat worked too. I mean, it was ripe for exploitation by those seeking a profit, and that certainly occurred during COVID. So I did hear a lot of echoes, I think, of that early kind of order with the state at its centre, but it's a state that is quite comfortable, quite relaxed about partnership with the private sector. I certainly heard a lot of that during the COVID pandemic. So, yes, I think it's another example, really, that you don't get very far, I think, if you begin your sort of understanding of this with what Paul Kelly called the Australian settlement in 1901 and protection and all of those things, the welfare state and so on, that he brings under that banner. In my view, you need to go back much further, and I'd certainly go right back to the very earliest years of the colony, as you suggested, Georgina.
So that idea of Australia as an egalitarian nation where there is the fair go for all could be argued to start at this commissariat. But what are the other defining features of that 19th century Australian democracy? Because we do have a sort of a really unique Australian shaping of our democracy that eschews so much of what could have come from Britain. I mean, things like the hierarchical aristocratic system, a church that's associated with the state. These things just didn't happen in Australia, and deliberately so.
It's a mixture, I think. I mean, broadly speaking, they do design political systems based on British models. Now, it's important to keep in mind, of course, that the British models are still evolving in the 19th century. So we talk about parliamentary government, responsible government. These are still at a quite rudimentary stage in even the middle decades of the 19th century. Broadly speaking, it's simply taken for granted that the basic kind of parliamentary nature of the British system will be taken over in Australia. The monarchical nature of the British system will be taken over in Australia. But you're right, there are some significant adaptations, and the church is one of the most important, actually. And this, really evolves in the 1820s and 1830s, and it is the rejection of an established church and the idea of an established church. It's the placing of the various Christian denominations on a more or less equal basis. This was very innovative within the British Empire at the time. It's most commonly attributed to Governor Burke, to Richard Burke in the mid-1830s via the Church Acts. And it had a deep influence, even down to this day. The way in which we marry, right down into the 20s that we're in now, is shaped really by the order that was established in the 1820s and 30s, the relationship between church and state. The ways in which even today clergy, if you marry in a religious environment, as most people have until fairly recently, the clergy operate effectively as agents of the state. And that really is a product of the 1820s and 30s. And you're right, Georgina, it's an adaptation. It was a very deliberate departure from the idea of an established church. And Richard Burke's very important in that because he's not English, he's Irish. He's an Irish Protestant in the sense, he's Church of Ireland, so if you like the kind of Irish equivalent of the Church of England. But he was an opponent of an established church. He believed his own church, the Church of Ireland, should be disestablished in Ireland because it represented only a minority of the population. And the Burkes, in fact, had been converts from Catholicism. So his broad perspective is, I guess, what you would call Christian, we call it Christian humanism today. I mean, it was this idea of a Christian subject, but not necessarily a Protestant subject. And yes, that's a very important innovation and departure certainly from English precedent. But, in a lot of respects, Australia's system it's quite closely modelled on the British system, at least until we get to federation, where, of course, there's a grafting of American federalism in a quite bold experiment, in a way, onto that British parliamentary system.
I mean, the fact that we could have had an Australian House of Lords, God forbid, we get a States House, of course, in the Senate, but that was roundly rejected. And the way universal suffrage developed in Australia was also quite different in its speed of evolution from the British experience. And, of course, the fact that women in South Australia were among the first in the world to get the vote. I think it was New Zealand, wasn't it, that pipped South Australia? But apart from that, Australia was quite a progressive, experimental nation or set of colonies when it came to developing its own unique form of democracy.
To observers, even the colonial political systems looked rather more American to their eyes, often, in the sense that the manhood suffrage came earlier, women's suffrage came earlier than in Britain, or indeed the United States for that matter. In the case of women's suffrage, in at least most parts of the US, there were some states that had it quite early. That's probably true. Certainly Australia travels along a path that we now call democratic earlier, more precociously, I think, than the United Kingdom. But again, worth keeping in mind that this is often being pushed in Australia by British migrants who have been exposed to or even a part of political movements like Chartism in the late 1830s and 1840s, early 1850s in Britain, which had advocated many of the kinds of things that become a part of the Australian system quite early, such as the use of the ballot in usually a kind of instead of open voting, the use of a secret ballot on a slip provided by the government, so a very bureaucratic system, manhood suffrage, the abolition of property qualifications for the lower houses, at least, of Parliament, I think is important. It's always tempered, I think, by this sense that you don't want to take it too far.
Yeah.
Australia,
that's what the Americans did.
Exactly, and it leads to corruption. That's right. They associated the US system with what they'd call log rolling and corruption, with excessive power by political parties. Terms like caucus, which had come out of the United States, were seen as very pejorative. So they don't want to become too American. They adopt bicameral parliaments and they endow the upper houses of the colonial parliament with very considerable power, including the power to block supply, to basically cut off the money supply to the lower houses. And, of course, this led to perpetual political crisis, constitutional crisis in Victoria, where you had an elected upper house, but one elected on a very restricted property franchise and even more stringent restrictions to actually stand for the Legislative Council. And that remained a very powerful house, which did block supply from time to time, right up to the 1950s. In some of the other places, the upper house was more vulnerable to pressure, to democratic pressure, because it was appointed, which meant that governments of the day would threaten to swamp it, which is, of course, what eventually happened to the House of Lords. It was shorn between 1909 and 1911, and in some ways a similar process occurred with the appointed upper houses in Australia. But in the case where they were elected in South Australia, they were elected in Victoria, they were elected in Tasmania, they remained very powerful. And that did reflect, I think, sense that whilst you couldn't really conceive of an Australian aristocracy or nobility occupying those chambers, and it was impossible to imagine sticking bishops up there, of course, you still needed a conservative break on radical democracy. So, there's an ambivalence, I think, about the British heritage in Australia. And they look at knighthoods and things like this too. And I mean, this is a point that, again, John Hurst made, that for all the supposed egalitarianism, they loved British imperial honours and there was a thirst for knighthood. So there was some taste, I think, for hierarchy in these colonies, which no doubt extended in all sorts of ways into the 20th century as well.
Yes, and despite there were, of course, Republican sentiments, weren't there, in 19th century Australia, the admiration for the monarchy was overwhelmingly strong. I mean, when you're talking about the Australian ballot, that it was secret and print, it does remind me that this is all about the fair go. We don't want undue influence, corrupting influence getting in the way of our political rights. We want to have each person gets the same vote, not interfered with, and your say on that process. I wanted to talk to you, Frank, about these dreamers and schemers, and obviously due deference to Josh Black's innovation with the title. But you think about the United States and, of course, the War of Independence and these, we're all very familiar these days with Hamilton and the sort of lofty ideals of all the rights and the way the Constitution was drafted. And it's a very aspirational story, and still today incredibly contested over documents that were drawn up 300-400 years ago. Australia, if you look at a lot of the development of our political system, it doesn't sort of have the same idealistic foundations as you might attribute to the United States. So when you talk about dreamers, I'd love to hear who you think are the real dreamers, but also schemers. The word schemer is think of it like a con man or someone who's hatching a very sort of, devilish plan to grab a lot of land or money or do something a little bit unsavoury. But, I guess that is all part of the story of building a nation, and there would have been lots of dirty deals done.
Yeah, I think this is sort of almost the meta-narrative of a book like this. I think my sense of a successful politician in a democracy such as Australia is they need to have a bit of both about them, don't they? The book does certainly look at a number of people who you would call dreamers. Someone like William Lane, who takes a number of Australians off to form a utopian colony in South America, is surely very much a dreamer. But I think the Paraguay, of all places, but I think those who have, been most successful within this democracy have tended to be able to combine both. They have had some kind of vision of the good society, of what a good society will look like, and of the kinds of things that you needed to do to craft a good society. But they also did have the political skills, the skills of scheming, if you like, that were often required to make that work. Alfred Deakin is a classic example, someone I've never been a great admirer of. I admire many of the Liberals of that generation. Deakin I've always, been very ambivalent about. And I think it's because his particular balance of dreaming and scheming could sometimes seem rather hypocritical. He often pretended to be above it all, I thought. But there were many instances of Deakin behaving in quite an underhanded way, as a matter of fact. But nonetheless, he was undoubtedly a very successful politician, Prime Minister on 3 occasions, and critical, obviously, in forming so many of the institutions and practices that would dominate Australian politics for many decades afterwards. So he's clearly someone who combined those different kinds of skills. I think we find them in Menzies and Whitlam, those two successful mid-20th century Australian democratic politicians. We wouldn't normally think of Menzies as a dreamer, but again, if you read famous documents like The Forgotten People, there is undoubtedly a vision of a good society there, a society of homes and families. And we know that he was a highly successful, pragmatic politician as well, and was able to realise things like high levels of home ownership, not least because he was willing to pragmatically, embrace a role for the state that's well beyond what we would now, see as acceptable under, or at least outside the mainstream of the present, in underwriting home ownership. The state clearly played a really significant role through regulation, interest rates and those kinds of things. You can see the different strands there. And the same with Whitlam, I think. We think of Whitlam as a great visionary, but Whitlam the visionary would never have happened unless you had Whitlam the schemer who was able to reform his party in the late 1960s and defeat the left, particularly in Victoria, the industrial left there. It required both, really. So I think the most successful politicians have tended to combine those different strands. There's obviously a huge distance, isn't there, between being simply a dreamer and simply a schemer. Politics is a complex business. It's a continuum. It's not a bad way of thinking about at least some aspects, I think, of our democratic politics, because I think to do it well, you've had to actually bring in both of those dimensions.
I mean, another way of characterising schema is, and Troy Bramston writes about this in his biography of Menzies, that you master the art of politics. So you might have the vision, like Whitlam and Menzies and our great political leaders, but you've got to have a way of executing it, and you've got to use the political processes that are available to you. And if you can do that effectively, if you can scheme through that, then you will be left with a great legacy. What I find really interesting about your book, Frank, is that it's not, though, just about the Menzies, the Whitlams, the Curtins, the Deacons, the Bartons. It's also about the very much lesser known political activists and, just everyday people. I mean, you focus on stories often at the beginning of your chapters on people like Fred Katz and, I love this name, Theophilus Gum.
That's right. Your fellow South Australian, Georgina, Theophilus Gum. Well, he's a classic dreamer, isn't he? I mean, someone who you wouldn't describe. I mean, he's a millenarian. He believes that we need social reform to make the world worthy for the coming of Christ, which is imminent, and his 1,000-year reign on earth. I mean, this is someone who is certainly a dreamer. I think to consider someone like, not as mainstream, he clearly wasn't, but some of his ideas are found in the broader mainstream of utopianism, especially on the left in the 1890s and early 1900s. I mean, Alfred Deakin, as we know, was a spiritualist and a theosophist, and would not have found all of the ideas of someone like Theophilus Gum totally foreign to him. So I guess what I try to do with some of those figures is also to show the ways in which, in their apparent perhaps eccentricity or idiosyncrasy, that they do actually reflect broader strains within the political culture. But yes, I mean, it is a book that tries, the questions that I asked right from the beginning, and I don't maintain them consistently throughout, and that's probably my failure, but the questions I ask are really, what have Australians expected of their political system? What have they demanded sometimes of their political system? How have they gone about achieving that? And what has it delivered for them? How has the political system evolved and responded to the kinds of demands they've made of it? And I think to do that kind of inquiry, yes, you can't just focus on a Curtin, a Chifley, a Menzies, a Whitlam. You need to go beyond that. You need to look at the activists, the middle-level activists, but also just ordinary people. And obviously, a number of passages in there where I use things like letters. I went through quite a lot of time actually looking through the letters to Menzies written by ordinary constituents. There's been a book on that since, actually.
It has. I've done a podcast with the author. It's very interesting. Frank, one of the characterisations of Australia and Australians and our political system is that it's utilitarian, and I guess that counters this sort of idea that there are dreamers, because to dream is not necessarily to be utilitarian. I mean, the greatest good for the greatest number doesn't exactly inspire people to go out onto the streets and fight for it. But you were originally a bit of a skeptic of this characterisation, but I understand during COVID you changed your view and decided it was
I did a bit.
pretty much defined us from beginning to current day.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the early work I've done was really in some ways countering that notion that our politics were notably utilitarian. And yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of writing over the years about those dreamers and their important formative role in our politics. I'd maintain that that's still true. As I said a few moments ago, I don't think we can ignore the roles that those dreamers have played. But yeah, COVID in particular, I think, did bring me back to a sense of the strongly utilitarian features of our culture. I mean, as you said earlier, Georgina, I mean, this notion of us being an obedient people. I don't quite like the term obedient, which is the one John Hurst uses. I'd love to be able to talk with him about it. Sadly, we can't do that anymore, but because it's very much based on popular consent. I mean, I think what happened during COVID is overwhelmingly, I mean, there were always people who were upset and people who protested, people who evaded the laws. I mean, that happens in any situation, but overwhelmingly, I think people accepted what their politicians, both federal and state, said they should do. And they did that not necessarily because they were just obedient, but because they had a sense that their popular consent, their consent had been, if you like, sought and given. And that happens at election time, but it happens in a broader sense, I think, through a more subtle process by which citizens relate to the state, citizens relate to government. And so I think people felt that governments deserve to have the space to make rules that would protect them. They accepted that governments had access to information that ordinary citizens didn't. They accepted that governments in a democratic system, governments that had been elected, had a certain legitimacy to be able to weigh up different kinds of claims and different rights. And all of that seems to me, yes, to speak to this utilitarian strand that is, as you say, about the greatest good for the greatest number. It has a dark side. It's often very bad at protecting the rights of the weak, the marginal, those whose voices are muted. We saw that it was very bad at protecting Australians overseas. You would think that the possession of a passport, being an Australian citizen, would give you the right to be able to come home. But we found, in fact, that in practical terms, governments were quite willing to compromise those sorts of rights around broader claims to public safety. I mean, it obviously related particularly to things like the availability of flights, the availability of quarantine in Australia. But what was striking about that is that governments felt able to make decisions that really undermine rights that I think most of us felt we had. I was surprised by that. I felt that you had a passport, you could come home, basically. I think probably most of us felt that way, but we learned something different, didn't we, during COVID? And I learned a lot about the political system that I didn't already know. And yes, undoubtedly it shaped my understanding and the way I wrote about earlier periods as well, not just very recent past.
You wonder how far the restriction of our rights could have gone before people started to push back. That was something I found sitting in Melbourne in the, world's longest lockdown, was when do we break? When do we say enough's enough? But clearly, and it's been revealed, the state government at the time was polling heavily the population in Victoria, I can't speak for other states, but in Victoria, and testing the popularity of these policies. And as you say, they were popular. People were consenting to them and supporting them. It brings me, though, Frank, to the question of state premiers and state politics, which if you look at national broadsheets, newspapers, the media, they almost ignore state politics. And aside from the sort of the occasional scandal or a change in leadership, there's not really the analysis of state politics or a scrutiny of state government policies or the opposition's policies that are in the lead up to election. It's usually how much money they're going to spray at an infrastructure project or how they're going to fix the hospitals or the ambulance waiting times, ramping, those types of things. But you counter that view, don't you, that actually state politics has been really important for political culture in Australia. And there have been these leaders like Jeff Kennett here in Victoria. There's, of course, Joh Bjelke-Petersen in Queensland and Jack Lang in New South Wales. They're pretty central to the political history of Australia, aren't they?
They are, and as someone who loves good writing, I mean, I'd also have to say that some of the really outstanding political writing that I can think of in recent sort of last 10 years or so has often been on state politics. I think there of Joel Dean's wonderful account of Victorian politics, Hatch and Kill or Rodney Cavalier on Power Crisis on New South Wales politics. And going back further, Peter Blasey's wonderful biography of Henry Bolte is another example, obviously a much older one. But yeah, look, very influential. I mean, in a lot of ways, again, COVID reminded us of their great power, the fact that they could close borders on us and the like, internal borders, which, again, people have kind of forgotten had been done in 1919 during the Spanish influenza epidemic, but people have forgotten just how much power state governments could exercise. But it's actually been part of a longer-term trend, I think. It's interesting. I've been doing a second edition of a book on the Labor Party, history of the Labor Party I wrote with Nick Dyrenfurth about 12 years ago. And obviously returning to that text recently, we were onto it even back then that state governments actually were doing some rather important things. A part of the story here is they regained much stronger borrowing powers in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s. And that meant, on the one hand, they were very subject to the credit rating agencies, but on the other, it also gave them much greater scope around things like infrastructure. And we know the Victorian government's a good example of this, where it's borrowed very, very heavily and has, I guess, been enabled to do that in a low interest rate environment that we've well and truly passed out of now. And we've also had instances of state governments really having quite ambitious intentions of shaping national policy too, which I think was very prominent with the Bracks government a few years ago in Victoria. Of course, the other area is social policy, and there's a whole range of fields. I mean, the return to abortion law reform, dying with dignity legislation, the Charters of Rights that a number of subnational governments, most recently Queensland a couple of years ago, have passed. You know, a whole range of areas, even things like the Oyster Parliament in South Australia, the Barnett government's agreement, Southwestern Aboriginal Agreement, which some legal scholars talk about as the Australia's first treaty a few years ago, a coalition government in WA. So there has been, I think, quite a bit of scope for experimentation, the innovation at the state level. And in a lot of ways, COVID just reminded us of how potentially significant state government power is. So yes, that is a theme of the book. And I give a lot of attention to state government generally, not just in the recent past, but really from federation onwards. Quite a difficult thing to manage, you know, to quite work out how do you sort of balance the two. Obviously, if you get too bogged down in detail of state government, you end up losing focus. But it did seem to me important that some of the really significant policy innovation in Australian history has come from the state level rather than nationally.
Yeah, and I think it's to your detriment if you ignore that. As you say, there's been a lot of experimentation around social policy that if you don't focus on state politics, you're going to miss, and you fail to participate in those debates appropriately. Frank, we are running out of time, but I wanted to end our discussion by talking to you about this sort of sense that politics and politicians are diminishing in the public's eye. We're trusting them less. We like them less. We like politics less, although we're obsessed with politics. And you just look at the obsession with the US political goings on over, the last sort of 8 years or so. Once again, we're sort of entering into the Republican primaries and it's across the media. But what is happening there? Why are we becoming less respectful of politicians and politics? Is it their fault? Is it our fault? Is it a combination thereof?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, a really difficult one. I don't have a sort of overarching theory. I mean, we do know, and I talk about this in the book.
Not enough dreaming?
Too much scheming, but the dreaming can be problematic too if politicians don't deliver. I mean, this has been one of the criticisms of Barack Obama, wasn't it? There was a lot of high-minded rhetoric. Did he deliver? Some people would say, no, not really. So, yeah, look, my book talks about the fact that in the 19th century, politicians were often held in very low esteem. So bad was their behaviour considered at times in the late 1850s, early 1860s that you had arguments in the press that we really should go back to having the pre-responsible government structures because they really disgraced the place. So those sorts of ideas aren't new. But it is true that the survey materials that we have, things like the Australian election study, have found a broad decline, but with one really important exception that may actually give us a clue to what's happening here. Political trust in Australia climbed enormously and dramatically during the COVID pandemic on every survey that I know of. Every survey that I know of, including the Edelman survey, which is an international one, compares Australia. It was an extraordinary recovery. Now, we've headed south again. It's gone back down. But maybe that tells us something, that political culture that we talked about earlier, where people look to the state to care for them, I guess, and which has clearly been wound back a whole range of ways for good reasons in many instances. We know the problems that was creating by the 1970s and early 80s. I'm not suggesting that we need to go back to a pre-sort of 1980s order, but I'd rather suspect that the winding back of that protective role of the state has actually affected political trust. And, of course, it's occurred in multiple countries, particularly perhaps the Anglo democracies. I mean, it's been a particular feature, certainly of Australia, Canada, the United States, Britain, New Zealand. And I wonder if one of the consequences of that has been that people are perpetually disappointed with government, that they look to it to protect them, to give them security in a world that can often seem very frightening to them and very unstable. So I do wonder if that sort of decline in political trust that we've seen, is it related to those broader shifts in, I guess, people's, isn't it, between, I think, a resilient sense among many people that the state should look after them and yet a response from the state that basically says, no, you need to do more to look after yourself. And I think that's where we've been in this country, really, since the reforms of the 1980s. And I think it does affect political trust. And obviously the situation in Australia hasn't been dramatically different from a number of other developed countries and Western democracies. So there's nothing totally unique or distinctive necessarily about the Australian case, but that's sort of how it's manifest. I think it will be made manifest in Australia, kind of a political culture that elevates the role of the state, and yet a political order and economic order for the last, 40-odd years has actually tended often to wind back the protective role of the state.
I wonder, though, if it's more to do with, I sort of said rather flippantly, but I do genuinely believe this, that we've had in recent years political leaders who are more focused on the art of politics, on the scheming, on the media messaging, on the 24-hour media cycle, on the handouts to win votes, rather than the big ideas, the big dreams, and that really effective combination of the two. We just aren't getting that in the sort of current and sort of more recent generations of political leaders. And is that partly to do with having this sort of professional political class rather than the more in our history we had politicians who'd come from union movement or law or business or farming or accountants, doctors, whatever, coming from the general community, from really the grassroots up, with a set of experiences that were unconnected to politics. And perhaps that background gives them that opportunity to bring with them a dream. And then if they're effective, they've obviously got the scheme. Anyway, Frank Bongiorno, I'm rather cruelly not going to give you right of reply there, but it has been an absolute pleasure, only because we've run out of time, not because I wouldn't want to hear your reply. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Afternoon Light. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And of course, for our listeners, please do rush out if you haven't already bought it and get Dreamers and Schemers, published by La Trobe University Press and widely available. And it's a great read and it'll be good nourishment for your mind and knowledge. Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.